I'm told that it is 11 of the clock, and given that my presentation is about 4.5 hours, I thought we should get started. No, I realize I am the final obstacle before lunch. Never a great position to be in, but I will try and get you out on time. My name is Terry Fallis. I guess I'm here in two guises this morning. For 35 years until March 2022, I was a communications consultant and spent a lot of my time, not a lot, but some of my time doing presentation skills training and media training for our clients. But starting in 2008, I also became a novelist, and I am now writing full-time, and I have 9 novels under my belt. The 9th one just came out at the end of August. Sorry? Still playing hockey. I am still playing hockey. I am. Yes, I played on Thursday, which is why I'm still walking gingerly this morning. I still play ball hockey. That features in my latest novel. So I've just come back. I'm still on West time. I was on a book tour out west in Winnipeg and Calgary and Victoria and Pender Island. But it's nice to be home. And it was a long time ago that I kind of got signed up for this, so I'm happy to be here. A caveat before we start. Even though I have media trained and presentation skills trained hundreds of people in my day, I have never done it for a group of ministers, of preachers. I don't know what to expect, but I'm hopeful that you will be civil and gentle. And actually, the closest I've come is I did media train all of the chaplains in the Canadian Forces. 1 year. It was many, many years ago, and they were quite pleasant. But my point is that many of you make a living standing up in front of people and connecting with them, engaging with them, passing on your wisdom and making their lives better. I'm not totally convinced that an hour from now you will think this provided much value to you, but I hope it does. I hope it does. So we'll see. And there are limitations that you might have and things you can do to make yourself more engaging when you're in church. But we're going to touch on a lot of different techniques and things that you can do, things that you may have not thought about for a long time. If you've been preaching week in and week out for years now, you may not have given thought to the dynamic that exists between the person at the front of the room and, in your case, the congregation. And I'm not convinced it differs that much from the dynamic that exists between a corporate leader at a conference and an audience, or a politician and an audience. I'm not equating you to politicians, but just, but thank you, yeah. But some of the techniques, the technical aspects of connecting with an audience don't change because you're in a pulpit and speaking, forgive me, down to a congregation or a politician standing in front of the House of Commons. So we will talk a bit about that. So here's what we're going to look at today. We'll talk a bit about goals. We'll return to this question, is preaching like presenting? And I would argue that in most ways it is, but perhaps not in all. We'll talk about goals you have for sermons, good sermons and bad. You've all heard bad sermons. I won't suggest you've ever given one, but you've probably given sermons that are better than others. And I wouldn't mind hearing some thoughts on what separates a good sermon from a bad sermon, or the characteristics of a good sermon and a bad sermon. We will talk about storytelling. It's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot these days, but there's been some neurological research that reminds us just how critical storytelling is when we're presenting to people and how powerful it can be. We'll talk about preparation briefly. I don't think you need me to tell you about how to prepare a sermon. I've made a bit of a study of it with the ministers I have known. But then we're going to talk about performance tips, the hardcore mechanics, the things you can do to connect with an audience. Things like voice, movement, eye contact, gestures, things that you do quite naturally but may not have thought about in a while. And then happy to have discussion after that. Our goals today, this may not be the quite way to phrase it, but I hope to ease any anxiety you might have when you do your preaching. Does anyone have any anxiety when you preach? Is your heart rate up a little bit? Yeah, okay, good. It ought to be. That's the reality, it ought to be. We'll come back to why in a few minutes. But my point is, my use of the word ease is quite purposeful. The word is not eliminate. I do not wish you to eliminate anxiety that you feel when you're standing in front of a group of people. Because as I hope to illustrate shortly, anxiety helps you connect with the audience. It makes you a little bit bigger. You're up. Your heart rate is a little elevated. If you are completely relaxed every time you walk up into the pulpit, I can almost assure you that you're not connecting as effectively as you might were you a little bit up. So we'll talk more about that. To build confidence that you might have in your ability as a speaker, just to make you better preachers. Those may be lofty goals, but that's where I'm heading. We'll see. First of all, public speaking is not a natural act. There's nothing built into our DNA that is designed to make us better speakers or to feel comfortable in the act. Public speaking remains a primal fear for many, many people. And probably not I hope it isn't a primal fear for those of you who are preaching every Sunday morning. But it's not a natural act, and it shouldn't feel like a natural act. And you ought not to worry if you have some levels of anxiety before you step up into the pulpit or from wherever you are preaching on that particular Sunday morning. So don't think that you're not cut out for this because I still get nervous when I preach. I think you ought to be getting a little bit nervous and anxious, and it's going to help you. So my premise here, I guess, is that preaching, it's not exactly the same as presenting. It's in many ways the same, and some of the techniques that we cover in presentation skills training, I think ought to have a role to play in making you better preachers. So a sermon is another presentation. Let's talk about what presentations can be. They can be formal and informal. They can be friendly or adversarial. I suspect that you're not doing too many adversarial sermons. I hope the congregation would feel the same. But they can be short or long, prepared or impromptu, small audiences or large, and it doesn't really matter. So in your world, types of presentations might include sermons. You've got to do weddings and funerals. You've got internal church staff meetings, and you're thinking, wait a second, that's not a presentation. Actually, I think it probably is. When you're sitting around the table, you've got the staff on your church staff who probably report in some way to you. When you're speaking to them, they're listening to you in a way as a presenter. So the techniques are different, but that's also a presentation. How many of you have given grace at community club luncheons in the city? I think of my friend Andrew Sterling. Do you all know Andrew Sterling, or some of you know Andrew Sterling? He was our former minister at Timothy Eaton Church, and I have studied his approach to preaching. But he will not only do those graces at the Canadian Club, but he will do the opening blessing before the Molson Indy. That's something that maybe you haven't had the chance to do yet. But those are all presentations, lectures, teaching, media interviews. How many of you have done a media interview at one point in your tenure? A few of you have. That's a very specific kind of presentation, and I used to spend quite a bit of my time helping people connect effectively with the media, because that also is not a natural act. So, for the presenter, virtually everyone gets nervous. Less so for this group, I would think, given your experience and the ease with which you now approach your job on a weekly basis and preparing your sermons and delivering it. But there ought to be some level of anxiety there, and preparation is the key to success, which is that's sort of a blinding glimpse of the obvious there. But I wanted to share with you some research that was done in the States that's been replicated in Canada, and they've done it both for presentations and for people doing their first interviews. I think I'm talking about interviews here. No, presentation. This is the data from presentations. So the research approached people who had just come out of a very big presentation at a major conference, say, where hundreds of people are there. And they also made sure their sample size, or their sample, was people who hadn't done this on a daily basis. So maybe slightly different from you, who are quite accustomed to standing in front of groups. But they asked the speakers after they came off, how stressed were you during the presentation? And when they assembled all the data, the stress time curve looked like this. And it would usually be, they would say something like, well, I said something kind of stupid at the beginning, then I calmed down in the middle, so I relaxed a bit, and then I said something stupid again at the end, and my stress level went up. I'm simplifying and generalizing a little bit, but that's, generally they said, I was really nervous at the beginning, so they asked the same people, how do you think you performed during your presentation? And as you might expect, their own perception of their performance was the inverse of their stress curve. They thought, oh, I was so nervous at the beginning, I didn't do so well. Then I calmed down, so I did better in the middle of the presentation, and then I said something stupid at the end. Now, that's not particularly interesting. It's almost predictable. You might have foreseen that had I asked you to predict it. But the important point in this research is that they then took videos of those presentations and showed them to a focus group. Think of the focus group as the congregation, in fact, right? And they asked the focus group, how do you think these people performed during their presentations? And when they assembled all that data and presented it, the focus group's perception of their performance paralleled their stress curve. In other words, when they got kind of relaxed in the middle because they thought they were doing pretty well, they actually weren't connecting as well with the audience. Right now, even though I have this microphone, I'm speaking in my presentation voice. If I were having lunch with you, just the two of us, I would be probably speaking with a little less inflection in my voice, a little more, it would just be a little more calmer and relaxed. But I know I have to bridge this distance that separates us, so I'm speaking in my big boy voice because I'm presenting. When you get too relaxed, you don't do that sometimes, right? So the bottom line is, we want your heart rate to be elevated just a little bit when you step into the pulpit. And even if you have to do that artificially by, doing a couple of jumping jacks, not in the middle of the chancel before you go up, but before you're sitting, waiting, and it's time to go up, you can just give yourself a couple of flexes. Remind yourself that you need to be up a little bit, that you're speaking to, whatever size of congregation you have, but they're not standing next to you. They're standing out there. And you can see this play out. The editor of my first novel, my first 6 novels, in fact, was Doug Gibson, who was Robertson Davies' editor. And Robertson Davies is one of my favorite writers. Doug was introducing him at an event, and they were both backstage. And as Doug was pacing, because he was nervous, he happened to walk by Robertson Davies, who was kind of hyperventilating, going, and Doug said to him, wait, you get nervous? And he goes, and Robertson Davies apparently said in his magisterial voice, oh yes, always. And then if you had seen him glide out onto the stage like a galleon and take the microphone, you would have not known that he was nervous at all. Nana Muscuri, the famous singer, the one with the glasses, she was doing a benefit in Toronto, and the person assigned, I have a helper today, Audrey at the back has been assigned to make sure I don't do anything wrong here today. But they had a handler for Nana Muscuri, And Nana Muscuri said to her backstage, "Oh, just let me get through this one more time." Like Nana Muscuri, who's performed on stages all around the world. So my point is, if your heart rate is not up a little bit, if your eyes aren't slightly wider when you walk up into the pulpit, you will connect more effectively if you give yourself a kick, if you need a kick, to put yourself in that frame of mind. So, good sermons and bad. Having listened to 3 now of, I think, the finest preachers I've ever heard, and many guest preachers too, but when I first started going to church and singing in the choir at Timothy Eaton, C. Andrew Lawson was the minister. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but I'm told he might be in the Hall of Fame of preachers, if were there one. And then we've had 20 some odd years of Andrew Sterling, who was a particularly skillful preacher. And now we have Jason Biasi, who is quite different from Andrew, but no less compelling for his particular style. So there's no one way to do it. I'm not suggesting that at all. But in their sermons, I always find I sort of know where they're going because they give us some sense of where they're going at the beginning. They are compelling and engaging. They almost always sprinkle their sermons with stories. We'll talk about why that's important shortly. And they're very articulate, and they know their stuff. Andrew Sterling would have not a single note in front of him before he would do his sermon. And sometimes I'd go to the 9:15 and the 11 o'clock service, and there's tiny little subtle changes in the sermon, but not much. In other words, he actually, memorizing is maybe not the right word, but he knows exactly where he's going. He starts by writing the whole thing out, then he breaks that down to about 4 pages. I shouldn't be revealing his secrets now, should I? Then he bullet points it onto a single page. That's probably by Thursday or Friday. And by Sunday, he walks up there without a note, not a note. And I don't think I could ever do that because I would be too nervous to do that. But he does it, and he pulls it off. But what about bad sermons? Who's heard a bad sermon? Why is it a bad sermon?
This was from a woman, the doctor from Oxford, who usually speaks well. I heard her speak well in September, but last month she spoke, as a colleague of mine said, it was a bad sermon because it was all lament. There was no good news.
Okay, yeah. All lament. You leave the congregation feeling not exactly uplifted, shall we say. It's fine to have some bad stuff in the sermon that's almost unavoidable sometimes, but to leave them uplifted. Okay. What about those sermons where people just drift away? And you can see that happening if you're an observant congregant. You can see people drifting away, and you can even see perish the thought, a phone come out at the back of the church. Just so engaging. You've got to be engaging, please.
I had this happen to me once, but anyway, this woman was in this church in Martin, and she was looking out the windows because there were nice clear glass windows. I was wondering, what have I said?
What have I said? Yeah.
Anyway, cut a long story short, my wife was talking to this woman after service.
Right.
And at lunch, she told me that this woman's best friend had a teenage son, 17, who committed suicide. Well, now I understand.
Now you understand. Did everyone hear that? Yeah, okay. Yeah, exactly. There's no accounting for what's going through people's minds in a church. They may be wholly justified in not being compelled by your stellar oration from the pulpit. That's understandable. But so bad sermons, not engaging, don't know where you're going, don't know what was accomplished at the end, and missed the point, missed the message. All of that. I'm sure that that has happened in churches where you have not been preaching, but been listening. So just to keep those things in mind, and that's exactly the same, frankly, as if you're at a major tech conference and someone from Microsoft is presenting on their latest new product. The same sort of rules apply about engaging an audience. Is it designed for them? Is it compelling? Is there storytelling? All of that. Everything okay, Jamie?
I just have the microphone for questions.
Oh, good. Okay. Excellent. Well, hopefully we're okay so far, but we'll be ready. Thank you, Jamie. So goals. I don't know if these are the goals that you have in your mind when you're writing a sermon. Oh, by the way, I'm happy to share the Dropbox link for all of these slides, so you need not feel like you need to take notes. Actually, they weren't thinking about taking notes, Terry. So I'll send that to Peter Holmes here, and he can distribute it as he sees fit, but you'll have all these slides. I just sort of made these up, but it seems to me that one of your goals is to reach the congregation, to engage them, to have them stay with you from the time they get on your bus at the beginning of the sermon. You want them to stay on the bus and not leave by the emergency exit, risking life and limb when you're halfway through. You want them to take the whole journey with you. I'm assuming you've got something to say. You want to entrench, we call them in the communications world, key messages. It's a bit of a jargony term, but you've got something you want to leave with them that they want to take away that will give them some hope or inform them about something. And finally, you want to maximize retention. If they can't remember the sermon by the time they've reached the parking lot, that's probably not a great measure of success, I guess. But you want them to take it with them and give them some comfort over the next few days. You want them to think about it. Oh, I remember when she said that. So those are goals. There may be others, but am I far off the mark, or is that what you sort of have in your mind in different words, perhaps? You really want to achieve something, though, to change or reinforce their behavior or their view. You want to give comfort. Now, it's not that different from when I'd be presenting to a corporate person. They've got a message they want to entrench too. You want to think about it for a long time, or as long as possible. So preparation. I don't profess to know much about preparing sermons. I've only given a few of them, and I've given none. But some thoughts did come to me when I was thinking about this, focusing on what is relevant to the congregation. What do they need, in your view, in that moment, in that week? Tailoring your remarks to their knowledge level. When you are doing your PhD in divinity, the way you speak in those classes is probably different than the way you would speak when you're in the congregation. So know the congregation, understand where they are, who they are, and what they need, as challenging a task as that might be, and design your remarks, develop your remarks for them. And you'll know if you've hit them too high or hit them too low. There are signs that you can pick up on, but you're looking for that sweet spot that goes through the great middle of your audience to maximize your retention and connection. There may be some hot button issues and safe zones that you know you can always the safe zones your refuge you can retreat to. But this is a difficult time to be preaching, I would think, given what's going on in the Middle East. And how do you balance that? It's a very polarizing issue for many people. So it takes some judgment that you have acquired and honed over years, particularly if you've been in the same congregation for a while. So knowing the congregation is important. Developing your sermon. The situation in the audience ought to dictate your approach, what you're preaching about, and knowing who you're preaching to, that gives you some guidance on how to approach it. I think when people are doing presentations or speeches or perhaps even sermons, A natural way to write one, I think about writing essays in university, is to do it chronologically. I'm going to start at the beginning and I'm going to write my way through to the end. I'm not sure that's the best way to do it. I think you want to have clearly in your mind what you want to leave in the congregation's mind. What do you want them to retain? If they remember nothing else about this sermon, I want them to remember these 2 points. Identify those 2 points at the beginning and build your remarks around them. Everything should lead to them and then from them, returning to them on more than one occasion probably to reinforce them. Illustrating with examples and anecdotes. I'm going to come back to that in the next slide because I think it's really very important. Consider humor where appropriate. How many of you put slip humor now and then into your sermons? Okay? Yeah, okay, good. Presumably you do that because you have a sense of humor. And you're not following a bullet point in a book where someone said, you should make this kind of funny in places. If you have no sense of humor, the humor may not work so well. But if you have a sense of humor, I don't know for the life of me why you would suppress it when trying to connect with an audience, why you would speak anything more than perfectly authentically. Now, obviously, judgment is required. Considerable judgment is required. And as a comic novelist, I speak from firsthand experience in my writing life. I know that in an audience like this, if I were to give you my first novel to read, maybe a third of you would keel over laughing, think it was the funniest thing that you had ever read. The group in the middle might say, well, I can see why it might be described as a comic novel, but I didn't exactly split my side. And then the third group over here, another third would say, I didn't find that funny at all. I have no idea what anyone's talking about. The diversity in our senses of humor is so broad. It's much broader than, say, you were reading a Stephen King novel. All of you would agree when it was scary. Or a Tom Clancy novel. All of you would probably agree when the tension was high and the suspense. A comic novel, that is the lot of a comic writer. We're not going to connect with everybody. And the same is so for the humor that you use. So knowing your audience is important, but I love humor in a sermon. It doesn't make the message lighter. It can actually make it more profound, I think, if it's wielded carefully and purposefully. So yeah, consider humor. I'm glad to see so many of you are using it. Involving your audience in some way, that's, we'll come back to that. That's a little difficult when you're in the pulpit, I think, but, and opening strong. If you remember nothing from what I've said today, which is a distinct possibility, opening strong is something that I think you would benefit from honoring. And I'm sure I'm not the first. That's a blinding glimpse of the obvious. But I think storytelling is something that is so important in preaching and in making almost any kind of presentation. They have done some neurological research that's quite recent, in the last 10 years, that might help me persuade you, if you don't do a lot of storytelling, to consider doing it. What we've learned is that human memory is actually story-based. It's, as a communications professional for years, we talked a lot about getting statistics and putting compelling messages together that would make our audience listen to it. And it was often stats and numbers, that kind of thing. That's not how the brain indexes information. They actually store it first as a story. It literally means that if stories are used in your communications, whether corporate communications or communications from the pulpit, the penetration and the retention of that story is highest. They'll keep it for longer. They'll gain access to it again because they've got it filed away in their brain. These are neuroscientists telling us this. This is not just me saying it. So storytelling is important. They will remember the story. I mentioned Andrew Sterling a couple times. When he would come up into the pulpit, I mean, he's sort of a relatively formal guy, but he's also got a great sense of humor and a self-deprecating sense of humor at that, which is always charming and endearing. But I just remember, and I would sit in the congregation. He would step up into the pulpit. The light would go on. Separate light comes on, illuminating him. Then he would stand there for a minute, and just sort of pause. And then he would say something like, one example would be, he'd say, "I got on the subway Monday morning and I sat down next to an old man." And when he would say that, I could literally watch the congregation lean forward. They would lean in to the story. I said, okay, what's going to happen? What's coming from this? And maybe sometimes the story wasn't a great story, but he gets us right from the beginning. You think about what he's saying, you want to follow what's going to happen, and then you're thinking, okay, well, how does that make sense how does that connect with what he's going to tell us? And then it does, and he tells us how. But he gets us on the bus by telling us a story. So now that we know that neurologists have sort of proven this, that we don't retain numbers, we don't retain data points, we don't retain statistics. But, you know, if I were working for a car company, or for Ford, say, and I would say, yeah, Ford gets 26 miles to the gallon. You know, I'm not going to retain that. But if I say, I got in my new Ford Fusion, filled it up with gas, and my wife and kids and I, we drove all the way to Montreal to watch the Leafs beat the Canadians, and we still had gas in the tank when we got there. You're thinking, gee, that's a long way to Toronto to Montreal without a fill-up. You know, that story sticks with them. 26 miles per gallon doesn't really mean that much to the average person. So I certainly encourage you to think about storytelling. And frankly, I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that. I mean, you're using stories now, right? You're using anecdotes to illustrate your sermons. I think if you continue to do that and even do it more, it's easier for the audience, for the congregation, to stay with you. Developing your remarks. Yeah, first words, open strong. And pausing before you start, I don't think it's a bad idea too. Lets people get settled, and then they're ready. Your intro, in a way, this is a cliche. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then through your content, tell them, and then at the end, tell them what you told them. This is an overly simplistic approach, but it's worth keeping in mind. If you're trying to reinforce these messages, you know, at the beginning, you might say, in the intro, you might say, I'm hoping that 20 minutes from now, I'm going to get you to agree with me that, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then you proceed to make your arguments and tell your stories that reinforce that position. And then at the end, remind them that that's what you hope they're going to be feeling now. It gives some framework and some focus for them to consider. And whenever possible, tell stories. See, that's one of my... All right, preaching tips. These aren't, I don't mean content-wise, but I have some thoughts on things that might help. You got to be you. Sometimes we think, all presenters, I think, feel this way, that when they step up in front of an audience, they all of a sudden have to be somebody else. I've got to switch into preaching mode. And I'm not talking about speaking a little bit bigger in your outside voice, because that's a given. You're going to do that. You need to do that. But it's your personality I'm talking about, and how your style. I think if you try to be somebody different, maybe it's more formal, maybe because it's serious stuff, you're probably not going to connect quite as well with the audience as you would if you were a slightly larger version of who you really are. Again, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But it's funny, having media trained and did presentation skills training for so many years, I see people, I've trained them, I know them. They're good people. They're relaxed, they're calm, they're funny. And then they go up and do their presentation, I don't recognize them. Kids don't recognize their parents when they see them on TV in a media interview. I just mean be yourself. Be a larger version of yourself because you're bridging a distance, but you are successful because you are yourself. And breaking into doing some role playing when you're preaching, as a congregant, I wouldn't think that would be a great idea. So just be who you are, dial it up a little bit. Involving your audience. So nailing the opening is a great moment for a story because you need to get them early. If you don't get them early, you're not going to get them 10 minutes in. They're probably already gone. So nail that opening. Break the ice early, the story, posing a question. I don't literally mean asking for a show of hands, although some of you that may work in your congregation. But even saying, if I were to ask all of you and then pose a question, I wonder what you'd say. And I think you might do, you can go on from there. But when you say something like that, the audience, subconsciously, they go, oh, wait a second, I should be listening to this. You're engaging them. You're making it more difficult for them to drift away. Relevant and meaningful examples, of course, and as appropriate, slip the humor in there. And there's lots of inappropriate times and humor that you can, when you use humor. So carefully, but I wouldn't shy away from it. I think the congregation in general likes it if it's who you are. It's part of being who you are. Jason Biasi is our still relatively new minister, and I love the way he preaches. I love the way Andrew preaches. Jason preaches completely differently. But I love it too, and it's no less compelling for the difference in styles. But he uses a lot of humor in his sermons. Not at inappropriate times and not inappropriate forms of humor. It just fits seamlessly into his message. And it only works because that's who Jason is. All right, reading the room. This is something I think presenters in general, and perhaps preachers too, forget. But a sermon is a dialogue. It feels like it's a monologue because you're just up there talking, but it's a dialogue, and the congregation is giving you responses, whether you're picking up on them or not. Their responses are not verbal, and there may be different reasons for it. Maybe there's been a death in the family and they're looking out the window because they can't engage. But they're feeling some comfort of simply being in the house that you're in. But definitely be on the lookout. People drifting, the neck snapping back and forward. That's happened to me. I mean doing it. It's also happened to me when I'm speaking, but you can look for things, and it depends how regimented or structured your sermon is. But sometimes when you see something happening, maybe you take that anecdote that was another 5 minutes away and you move it up to try and get them back from the brink. If you're able to roll with it and change on the fly, I'm not suggesting that's easy, but they are giving you nonverbal feedback, and you can adjust as required, even if it's adding more inflection to your voice and speaking a little bit louder so it's harder for them to drift away. Okay, preaching performance skills. There are only really 4 things that you can do beyond the content that you have, the sermon that you have crafted. You've got eye contact, you've got gestures, and by gestures I really mean sort of use of your hands and as you are standing up there. Movement. Usually, if you're preaching from the pulpit, there's not a lot of scope for movement. I guess you could spin, but I'm not sure that would be a good idea. Yeah, exactly. But some pulpits are kind of large, and often the pulpit has, I know at Timothy 8 in the pulpit is reasonably spacious, and there's a sort of a lectern like this, and there's actually room to be talking like this, and then, to walk out and lean like this. So we'll come back to movement, but there is some scope for movement. And your voice. Your voice is an instrument. You instinctively have been using it your entire life, but you have great flexibility in how you use your voice to convey different emotions or different requests of the audience. I really want them to listen now, so you speak a little quieter and lean in. And subconsciously we think, oh, what's she saying now? And you lean in a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about each of these, but don't think of them as 4 separate items. Almost by necessity, we have to list them as 4 separate items, but how are we doing on time? I forgot to start the clock. 11:42. Okay, we're okay. We're all right. Think of them as sort of, think of them seamless integration. Think of them as one unit. It's not like, okay, Terry said eye contact, so I'm going to do 5 minutes of eye contact now, and you start, and then movement, and then you start to do some. They aren't separated. It's seamless. It's a whole package. Think about the whole thing. So let's talk about eye contact. It's really hard for people to drift away if you're looking at them in the eye. So it engages your audience. It helps keeps them with you, and it builds trust. When they're saying something serious and they're looking right at you, they're building trust. Makes you more credible because you're willing to look at the audience you're speaking to. How often have you heard people say, yeah, I stared at the clock at the back because I was so nervous? Do you think they were able to engage the audience very well doing that? Probably not. It does convey a sense of confidence, and ministers in the room, you have to deliver some bad news now and then, or you certainly have to deal with situations that are sometimes tragic. I can't think of a more important time for eye contact, and serious eye contact, than when you're comforting and consoling or delivering bad news. So, but how long do we make the eye contact? Long enough to register, but not so long that someone thinks they're being stalked. And avoid what we used to call the machine gun. Somebody said you should make eye contact, so they start here and they start talking like this, and they look over here, and then they move back this way. That's not the kind of eye contact I'm talking about. Think of it in different ways. In small groups, you got to connect with everybody and not play favorites. It's tough way over here. I've tried to look at you a couple times, but it's a long way to go over here. But people notice if you're looking at everyone but me, you know. So reach everyone in small groups. In larger groups, if you're a football fan, in larger groups you're playing zone, not one-on-one. So you pick a zone, and you pick a few people in the zone, and you engage with them, but you pay tribute to every zone in the audience. I would usually look for people who are nodding heads or laughing more, because okay, I've got someone there, I've got an ally there, and you keep sort of focus on them when you go by, and which is your way of saying just keep doing that. That's great. So nodding heads, bright sweaters. And sometimes, here's the worst one. I've just come back from some festivals. I was at Calgary Word Fest, and there I did I did a session, Linwood Barkley and I, and a moderator, and it was theatrical lighting. Everyone been in with theatrical lighting? It's like a black velvet curtain has descended in front of the audience. I had no idea there was anybody in the room, except when you could hear them laughing or rustling about. And that's the hardest, except they don't know you can't see them. They don't. They're perfectly lit, sitting right in front of them. They don't know that you can't see them. So it makes eye contact just as important, but more difficult. You're literally, looking here and you can't see anything, but you're talking to them as if there are people right there, and they think you're making eye contact with them when you may be making eye contact with the chair next to them that's empty. But that's still better than not making eye contact at all. I sometimes even say, wow, this theatrical lighting is something. Is anybody out there? I can't see a thing. And then you've at least managed expectations a little bit about how sincere the eye contact is likely to be. But eye contact, it's really important. So And it's a sign of confidence, I think. The nervous speaker is scared to look at the audience sometimes. So you're not in that position, I know, but in general, that's what happens. So eye contact is important. Gesturing. Any hand talkers in the group? Lots of hand talkers. Okay, has anyone ever told you not to talk with your hands? Have they said to you, you're up there preaching, sometimes they give you a tip. They say, hold your thumb in front of you like this to keep your hands from moving so that it's not distracting. I mean, that's a very common thing for hand talkers to be told. I disagree completely. Because you know what happens if you do that? You grip this is the thing you do because in media, you're covering up your set of knuckles here. You're squeezing really hard. You're nervous. Your knuckles go white. You don't want your knuckles to be white on camera. That's why you don't sit like this, because your knuckles go white when you're sitting there waiting for the next question to come. So you grip your thumb and you put your hand over top, and then you can sort of stop yourself from using your hands. And you know what happens? Your shoulders start to go. Like, you've been doing it for so long, that energy has to go somewhere, and it often goes in other kind of movement, which looks a little weird, frankly. So, frankly, I think talking with your hands is a great way to reinforce your points. It animates what you're saying. It lengthens the attention span of the audience because there's more to look at than just someone standing there stone-faced and talking with their hands gripped in front of them. So by all means, talk with your hands. I think it's a great thing to do. Now, you want to have some variety in what you do, but I think it should be natural. Don Murray is one of CBC's, or was one of CBC's great foreign correspondents. He came out of radio. And of course, talking with your hands on radio is less relevant as far as engaging the audience is concerned. But when he made the switch to television, and he'd be based in Moscow or something like that, he'd be doing his stand-up reports on a street corner behind Red Square behind him, and he'd be talking, and he would just stand like this, and because he never really talked with his hands. And his producer said, Don, you're on TV now. You got to give us a little something more than just standing straight up like a sentry at Buckingham Palace. And he developed this one thing that he did. He would stand there and he'd do his reports like this, and he'd talk, and Vladimir Putin came to the Kremlin today, and he'd do this. And now that is distracting, because it was not connected at all. Mike Duffy, the former, I guess he's still a senator, isn't he? But he was a former CTV Parliament Hill reporter. His thing was he'd have a rolled up sheet of paper in his hand. And he'd talk like that. And you'd see this sheet of paper, presumably with his notes or other erudite musings. And that's what he did. But if you talk with your hands, make it natural. Other things you can do, hands front and center. The one caveat is you don't want to put your hands in front of your face. If you put your hands in front of your face, you're breaking the contact with the audience. And I would be careful about, well, it's okay for ministers to gesticulate widely, like hands out here. On TV, if you're doing that, of course, the frame is much closer. You look like a double amputee waving your, anyway. So on TV, keep it close in. Keep it close in. But watch for bad habits. Things like hands in the pocket jingling your keys or your change. You've stopped hearing the keys jingling if you do it often enough. You've stopped. But it's deafening to everyone else and distracting. So watch for bad habits and just keep it natural. It works best if it's, wrong slide, I'll stay on gesturing. It works best if it matches the words. So if you're talking about, well, I want to talk about 3 things today. First of all, and you can just, that's a very simple one, but it makes it more interesting to look at than just saying, I'm going to talk about 3 things today. So keep it natural. If you don't talk with your hands, don't be Don Murray and start because someone standing up here said that you ought to talk with your hands. I'm talking to the hand talkers here. You keep hand talking. Those of you who don't do it, it's hard to make it look natural if for the first time in your 49 years you're going to start talking with your hands. It'll probably look a little comical and won't ring true. Going back to that earlier slide, you got to be you. Okay, movement. This is the most challenging one, I think, to talk to you about because I think you're quite limited in your movement. Who preaches only from the pulpit? Okay. Oh, that's someone telling me I've gone on too long. Okay, does anyone preach from the pulpit but occasionally from the chancel steps? Okay, a few do. Preaching from the pulpit, there's a certain dynamic when you're speaking from the pulpit. You're literally higher than everybody else. You're above everybody else. You're talking down to them, at them. It's just a certain thing, and it's traditional. Maybe is it because ministers are presumably closer to God? I don't know. I wasn't a joke. I was actually curious. I mean, the pulpit, you want to be looking up at something. Sorry? Oh, okay, acoustics.
Because the sound was a little bit higher without microphones, and it would go up and over the pulpit.
You know, that makes total sense. I should have thought of that. A more pedestrian reason than the closer to God thing. But thank you. But you know, I think if you have the flexibility of moving, those of you who do it from the chancel steps, I mean, Jason does that in our church because we have, at the 9:15 service, it's a little more, it's casual, more casual. And he will stand in the chancel steps, sometimes sit on a stool. But there's a lot more flexibility in engaging your audience when you're speaking down from the chancel steps. You can walk around like this. There's no reason, I don't think, liturgically, I may be wrong, that you couldn't, even head up the aisle a little bit and talk to your group like this. You can engage them much more closely. It's harder for them to drift away and get off the bus. In fact, some of them who got off the bus already can get back on the bus when you are coming up close to them. It makes it more animated and more interesting, gives them something to look at, more engaging. I'm not suggesting that you ought to try it. I just mean that when you're stuck in one place, anchored to the podium, it's easier for people to get, bored's not the right word, but it's not as interesting as if you're walking around. And when you're walking around, you can use your movement actually to signal different stages in your talk. You can be telling a story, and then you can turn and say, do you know what happened then? Or do you know what he said then? Or do you know how it ended? And then you turn and they're with you. So I would think about movement. It also demonstrates great confidence. It works best if it's natural and controlled. I remember in high school, we had a talent show, and a woman came on stage, sat on the stool, and she sang a very bad version of Barbra Streisand's Evergreen. I'll never forget this. And then in the middle of her song, there was a power outage. It was only for about 2 or 3 minutes, and everything stopped, and she was, and before the power outage, at a certain point in the song, she had got up off the stool and started walking around, and then the power outage came. So then everything came back on, and she reset. She sat back down on the stool, and then at that same moment, she got up out of the stool again, and it just looked so rehearsed and contrived that we didn't, everyone said, oh, that didn't work so well. So it should be natural, but you should let your remarks tell you what natural is, the way you would normally phrase something, and where is the moment where you want to stop and turn, because you want their undivided attention for that part. It's okay to talk, looking sideways for part of the story, but then you want to turn and engage them. You have more flexibility at your disposal than when you're anchored in the pulpit, I think. What else? Only if it's really you. Everything has this caveat, only if it's really you. Not trying to remake you into somebody else. You've got to be you. Tips, Even when you're in the pulpit, leaning towards the audience a little bit. And they may not notice it, but their subconscious can see it. When you're leaning forward, you're more engaging. If you're like way back here, trying to avoid getting closer to the audience, the same in media interviews. It looks like you're disengaging. Matching the movement to your words, yes, natural, not contrived. Yeah, I've said here, perhaps try preaching from the chancel. I mean, I just wonder what it would be like if you haven't done it before and there's nothing, the Sanctuary Guild won't have a conniption about it, just to give it a try and to see how it might work. All right, in the last few minutes, let's just talk a bit about voice. Obviously, this is such a key element in an effective presentation. You can do so much with your voice, different emotions. It is a very versatile instrument that you probably have forgotten is an instrument that you can use and play differently for different parts of the talk. You can vary the pacing. Sometimes you can add energy to it by speaking faster in some sections. Sometimes the power and the drama of what you're saying can be enhanced by slowing it down and pausing and delivering the final message at the end. Inflection. Who's heard Margaret Atwood speak? Anyone? I love Margaret Atwood. She has been very, very good to me. But her vocal range is about like this. And it's why Margaret Atwood doesn't read her audiobooks. It just wouldn't work. She's extraordinary, but that's one of her issues. So you've got a huge range. Vary the intonation. Go up, go down. Use the full range of your voice without it sounding like you're trying out for the high school musical. I don't mean that, but just, and when you're up here, like listening to my own voice, when I'm using my full inflection range, it feels a little theatrical. To the person sitting at the back, it probably sounds quite normal. And if you were talking in your normal voice, they would have disengaged by now, probably. So use your voice for all its worth. Volume. You can speak louder, obviously, at times, and you can speak softer. Sometimes, when you know you've got the audience, you can speak quite softly, and they're with you because they're engaged and they want to hear what you're going to say. And there's a certain drama about lowering your voice to I don't mean to a whisper, unless you have a really good PA system, but lowering your volume, it just adds more interest. And practice so it's natural. Practice is an important thing to do anyway, because I don't know if you practice your sermon. Does anyone stand up in the pulpit when nobody's there and work on their sermon? Okay. Well, you do it too. Okay, great. I'm glad to hear that. And do you find that helps you? Yeah. You can hear it. Exactly. It's like writers who read their chapters aloud. That's how I edit, as I read my chapters aloud, because a phrase that sounds splendid in my mind as I'm writing it sounds a bit clunky when I read it out loud. So, good. So practice. It's important. Also, you want to practice enough that it feels natural, that it sounds natural. It's kind of oxymoronic. I think of Andrew Sterling. He practices, writes it all down, memorizes it, or at least the flow of it, and he does all of that work so it can sound like he's doing his sermon off the cuff, which is extraordinarily impressive when you think about it. He fully so articulate, eloquent, not a botched word, not a stumbled sentence, and that's because he can make it look so natural because he practiced so much. He probably has a gift for memory as well, which I concede, and not all of us have that. I don't, but it's worth reviewing. The first time you give your sermon, not to be on Sunday morning, I guess is the bottom line, right? Okay, helps you engage with the audience too, and helps you entrench your messages. Let me just close by saying preparation and practice. I wish there were a silver bullet, but unless you are extraordinarily gifted, and some are, there are gifted orators who just have an ability to stand up in front of a group and hold them in the palm of their hands. But generally, we're not like that. Those are rare birds and you hope they're ministers, because that would be great. So preparation, knowing your audience, building your presentation around your messages, storytelling, I'll just harp on that word again. And on the technique side, the performance technique, eye contact, gestures, movement, and voice, to the extent that you're able, given the limitations of the ministry, as it were. But there are things I'm sure you can do that you haven't necessarily tried yet that might help lengthen the congregation's attention span, keep them with you on the bus until you pull in and the offertory anthem is about to start. So, anxiety is natural and it helps you. I'm not talking about debilitating anxiety where you have flop sweat and can only utter monosyllabic grunts. That's the kind of paralytic anxiety that would not serve you well. But having your heart rate up a little bit, having your stomach feeling a little bit not quite itself, all of that helps you engage more effectively with the audience. Your eyes are a bit wider. You're bridging this distance that exists between you and the congregation. You're not having lunch with them, sitting across the table. You're in a big room, so you've got to reach them. So anxiety is natural and often helpful. Here endeth the sermon. How are we doing on time? Yes, perfect time. Okay. If I haven't put you all to sleep, happy to have discussion or questions or yes.
Near the beginning, you referred to having a safety zone. I don't understand what that concept is. Can you explain it a bit?
Sure. Safety zone, I think, would be if you know your congregation, you know that they've been really supportive of something, maybe the food bank that's in the building. The food bank becomes like a safety zone for you. If you can link the food bank into something that you're saying, you know you've got broad support for the food bank here, so if I just push myself into that zone, but try to make a connection to what I'm talking about, I might have a better chance, I guess. That's what I mean. And you know the opposite, of course, the danger zones. We know there's been great controversy and debate about this topic, so unless I have a point, I'm not going to venture near there if I don't have to, I guess. But yes?
One of the challenges I find is that since we started doing live stream, I'm much more restricted because of where the camera is. So I can't preach from the chancel anymore. I have to stay in one spot.
Yeah, did you ever hear the question or the comment? That is a really good point, and I should have thought of that, because the same is so in our church. That's true. So what it means is you're limited to what you can do in the frame of the camera. So it might bring your facial expressions more into play, because at Timothy Eaton, when Andrew or Jason are preaching, sometimes you can be so far back that you can't always exactly see what's on their faces. But streaming, it might be quite tight. So your face becomes another vehicle you can use. That sounds a little weird, but I just mean it means you have to be more cognizant of what you're saying and matching a facial expression to reinforce it rather than oppose it. So that's probably something more to remember, not something helpful to you, but hands become probably more your friend if you speak with your hands, to give some thought to what you're doing to enforce these points you're making, and your voice. I mean, those are things that don't require space. So, and recognizing that if people are watching it streamed, the audio is probably quite good, and you can get your voice down quite low in a dramatic moment. Low as in quiet, I don't mean baritone low. And that might add something to the drama of the message. But other than that, I know, the movement thing is kind of out. All of a sudden, she just, wait, come back. Yeah, that's tough. That is hard, and that's, mind you, I wonder if it allows you to reach a broader audience. It's a mixed blessing, right? Having Zoom and streaming. Other thoughts? Yes.
Does the research show anything about the ideal length
of a talk?
I think the research tells us that that the length of the talk is dictated by the performance abilities of the person delivering it. In other words, if you are a really dynamic speaker and have a great message and the content is all there, you can probably go 25 minutes and the only people who will notice will be the person in the radio room saying, we've got to close this up now. But so I think the length is only important if the speaker is substandard in a way. And then, now, what are sermons? 15 minutes? Is that about right? Depends on the church. 10 to 20 minutes? Yeah. Okay. So that gives you lots of range, but I think what's more important is the performance abilities of the preacher. You can hold someone for a lot longer than a 20-minute or 15-minute sermon if you're really good. So it's kind of like if the content is lacking, a shorter sermon is probably better. But if the content is lacking, but the performer is great, you can probably make it through that, because you're compensating for content by performance. So both are kind of at play in the length of a sermon. But sometimes I've heard lots of sermons that I didn't want to end. And I've heard a few that I didn't want to start. So I think length is a very subjective thing. But I wouldn't worry about length if you're a good performer. Other thoughts? Sir?
By its very nature, Christianity from the very beginning has been controversial. Now, lots of people, I'm afraid, in order to pursue success, wouldn't touch something so powerful, and therefore, to that extent, they may not be entirely authentic.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at some point, if you get into this job, this profession, you know that first of all you're dealing with controversial material.
Right.
And secondly, like this time in human history, you're going to face insoluble controversies, and you may decide not to touch them or to get into them, which presumably is the road to martyrdom, but still.
The road to martyrdom.
So the question is, are you going to, just calm out, or are you going to face it?
Right.
What do you do in order to engage without being inauthentic to your material?
Right. Did everyone hear that question? A good question. The notion of Christianity has always been controversial. Are you going to take on an issue and wade in, or are you going to stay back from it and pretend that it doesn't exist? And there are costs to both approaches, I would think. We're maybe getting out of the realm of sermon presentation style. But I would think, personally, those who do wade in, but who wade in a substantive way with thoughtful arguments rather than the knee-jerk black and white stuff, and recognize the views on the other side, even if they don't agree with them, I think they're probably they're more likely to be remembered for the risk they've taken than if they just didn't do anything and just pretended it didn't exist. I imagine that approach would color almost everything they do in their role, and so I would probably favor the former. Not that my view is relevant on it, but I know what you mean. We've all had those issues in our church, and what's going to be said about it today, and nothing was said, or okay, well I didn't agree with that, but at least it's out there and we know. But that's a tough one. It's a tough one.
When I was a student at Western, I sang a choir at a church, and in the first 2 years there, the guy came close to saying something twice. And then he got promoted to a church in New York, so succeeded.
Well,
But I didn't think he succeeded in the right
Right.
way.
right, exactly. Yes, exactly. Thought it might be a hand over here, sorry. See, that's tough over this space.
My congregation is an older building with an L-shaped sanctuary, and now we're dealing with cameras. And so what has happened over the years has evolved for me is that I've now become to understand that my children's story, which gives me much more flexibility,
Yes.
is part one of the sermon. It allows me to be in a different space, to move around, to engage in a different way, to add humor. And then it's different when I go up into the pulpit, but it's not part one and part two,
Right.
but the two have blended together, and that has been very helpful for me in my sermon preparation and in just planning and stuff, that I know that is an important part of how I'm able to engage just because of the space that we have.
Right. I think that's a great point. Did everyone hear that? I think that's a really good point, because you're still being you. It doesn't have to be the same you who's talking to the kids as talk to the congregation in your sermon. Obviously not. But it is your personality is revealed to the others through your interaction with the children. And I think that says a lot about a person, and that probably helps you a great deal, I think.
Yes, and what happened was that I don't have a big Sunday school, so when there were no kids, I stopped doing children's stories, and I got feedback right away.
Right.
Go, if there is no one here, we will have 80-year-olds come and sit in the front row,
Right.
so that you can have that engagement. It's become a very special time.
Isn't that great?
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing.
I think that's terrific. And sometimes children's stories are, I've seen it in various churches. I think it can be done well, and it can be done not so well. But it sounds like you've hit the formula, and I think that's terrific. And those kids, they remember it too. So I think that's a really good point. Very good. Yes?
Yeah, just to piggyback on that,
Yeah.
I found that, you put a lot of work into a sermon, right? And I'm at a progressive church, so the sermons are, we take on the hard topics.
Right.
But what the congregation remembers is the children's time. Because I'll use props, right? I'll use
Magic
props.
tricks, craziness.
Yeah, and I simplify the message, and I agree with you. It's like the prelude to the sermon. It's the children's sermon. So,
Right.
I've already written the sermon.
Right.
It's the last thing I figure out. So it's usually the piece that's missing, or I know I can be much more concise in the children's sermon.
You have to be, even.
Yeah, the other day I did a children's sermon where I just held up a green leaf, and I said, you know what, all leaves are turning, and I pulled it away, and behind it was an orange leaf. And I said, you know what, science tells us that all those colors that you see in the fall are always in the leaf, but they're covered up by the green. And I think people are like that. That's what they remember from that Sunday.
Right. Well, it's a
Because
message we
it's
could all
engaging.
hear.
Sorry.
It's a message we could all do. We're all doomed to hear. So,
But
that's
it's
sure.
one of those things where it's like sight, sound, laughter, all
Right.
sorts of parts of their brain are being engaged, whereas that particular Sunday I was behind the pulpit, which I'm not always. And, every sermon behind the pulpit looks the same and is remembered the same.
Right.
Because it was, that guy behind the pulpit.
Yeah, all you have when you're in the pulpit is what's coming out of your mouth and how you convey it. There's no other memory touch points. Right. Understood. That's a good point. Yeah.
But
Yes.
there can be.
Okay.
And I think, I preached one years ago, and I started by saying, my life screams IKEA. And then I talked about how our apartment.
It's a good opening.
Our first apartment screamed IKEA, and I talked about the different things, and then the whole point was our lives should scream Jesus.
Right.
And when I left that church, people still remember that story.
Right. The IKEA sermon.
Yeah, and so we have to use things that
Yes.
people engage with.
That's right. That's right. Who hasn't been to IKEA and assembled or tried to assemble? Yeah. We have an unpacked IKEA box right now in our bedroom, a bookcase that we have not yet put together. But your point is well taken.
Can you say something to those of us that are preaching a lot? Like, this is not just, so we've done mission work. Come home, hey, you've got some good stories, you're going from church to church. You can preach all the time without notes.
Right.
And we have different, we're both husband, wife,
Right.
pastor, pastor. He preaches very differently than I do.
Well, that's interesting.
But it's partly like when our kids were young, I said to him, we can't do it both your way, where he was practicing his sermon 3 times on Saturday night. I said, there is no way.
Right.
One of us has to be sane.
Yeah.
That was me.
The Leaf game is on anyway.
No. but when we're preaching these things, I think these things help us. But can you say more about that? Maybe there isn't.
Yeah, well, if you're going from church to church, it means that the content doesn't have to be completely refreshed every time you stand up. You've got a few sort of stock, like a stump speech, as it were, for a politician, that you can adjust. And that's helpful, because you probably get better at delivering that, because you notice what works better in different phrasing and all of that, and timing. So the trick is, though, when you're saying the same, versions of the same message over and over, is how to keep it fresh. And that means adding new examples and connecting it to that particular audience, instead of remembering it from the audience you did it in front of the week before. But I think it's tough to keep it fresh if you're, when I say recycling, I don't mean that in a negative way, because they can be really powerful messages. And certain ministers have, that's the such and such a sermon, and he or she has given it 14 times over the course of the last 5 years. I think that works great. But it's keeping your energy up, so you're connecting in the same way, because you know the talk. I've given over 1,000 book talks since 2008. I didn't know that. Somebody foolishly counted it up on my website and sent it to me. But I'm getting the sign. It's lunch. Remember, it's lunch. So I'll just wrap up. The trick is to make that talk feel like it's the first time you've ever given it, even though you've tested these lines out. I have no idea if that is what you were asking, but not really, no.
I was thinking more about those of us, we're now preaching in churches. But I think that makes sense for Easter and Christmas, because we're preaching the same message, and we have to keep it fresh.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Keeping it fresh. Thank you all. Thanks for having me. Thank you.